Hey guys, hope everybody's doing well. Today I've got another great guest. Michael Kennedy works at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and is the author or co-author of the yearly report, Campus Freedom Index. How you doing, Michael?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for coming on the show. So I thought what we'd do is start with you describing for us what the mandate and objectives of the center that you work at is all about.
Yeah, the Justice Center was founded in 2010 for the purposes of defending the constitutional rights and freedoms of Canadians. And we do that through education, through reports like this one, and legal analyses on various issues, current events that relate to our constitutional rights. And we also take on legal defense for Canadians when their rights are infringed upon by government or government entities, such as our public universities. And so we're defending a number of students now who have been censored on campus, in addition to Canadians who have had other fundamental freedoms violated.
So if I understand correctly, then you're not strictly restricting your, programs to the educational context. That is one of several places where these violations might occur, correct?
That's correct. And we're currently involved in a number of cases outside of the free speech issue, even though free speech, both on and off campus, is one of our primary focuses. And in general, the four fundamental freedoms outlined in the Charter define the core of our mandate. We're taking on a number of cases now involving freedom of association rights for Trinity Western University grads. We're also involved in recommendations to the assisted dying legislation federally. So we have a broad range of activities at the moment.
So are you in touch at all? Because at least in the educational domain, some of your program seems to be related to FIRE, the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education. I actually had the director, who's a good friend, Greg Luciano, on my show. Are you linked with these guys in any way? Do you cooperate together inter-country?
We've been working together informally for a long time, and we've certainly been inspired by what FIRE is doing south of the border. And when we were just starting out with this Campus Freedom Index project, we drew on their expertise and their suggestions and advice and their best practices and experience, and it really helped formulate our report. Of course, the First Amendment in the United States is a much better model, you could argue, than the Canadian law. So they, in many ways, have it a lot easier, and especially when it comes to defining how the Charter applies to university campuses in the United States. It's much more clearly entrenched that the First Amendment applies to public universities, whereas in Canada, it's still very much a legal gray area. But we've certainly worked with FIRE a lot. And we're also working with Spike, the free speech rankings in the United Kingdom, which are a more recent report, and we all try to work together and share best practices as much as possible.
Well, that's certainly gives a lot of people solace to know that all of these wonderful organizations are cooperating their efforts or coordinating their efforts. A lot of people ask me when I appear on different shows, how are some of these issues, how serious are some of these violations in Canada versus the U.S.? And I guess they ask me this precisely because I've been a professor both in Canada and in the U.S. So they want to know, for example, are the social justice warriors, as vociferous here versus to our southern borders? From your cooperation with FIRE and others, how would you answer that question? Are we better off than our neighbors in the South, or are we worse off?
We are definitely worse off. The law in the United States is much more clear and much more involved and defined as far as how do free speech rights rank when it's on a university campus, a public university campus. In Canada, some provinces like Ontario have ruled at the Court of Appeal level, at least, that universities, even public universities, are private or quasi-private institutions, and so the Charter doesn't apply in every case. Whereas in Alberta, we had a recent ruling, the Pridgeon case, where the court did rule that the university is not a charter-free zone, that the Charter does apply. So in Canada, we're troubled by this legal gray area that we find ourselves in as far as how the Charter rights free expression apply. But at the same time, the Canadian legal system also gives us other avenues to defend free speech rights, such as through administrative law mechanisms, through asking universities to uphold the rule of law, and through contract law. So there are another number of other avenues that we can use that maybe they don't have to rely on so much south of the border because it's more firmly defined. But I would say that given the charter application to universities and our history with human rights legislation and how that plays into the university campus, we're certainly suffering a lot more legally. That said, though, it's interesting to note that it seems like the radical left in the United States, in many ways, is more activated on campus than we are, and this growth in the use of trigger warnings and safe spaces and these sort of tools that the left uses to try to shut down protected speech, they really did take a hold in the United States, and it's spread a lot faster there, it seems, than it has on Canadian campuses.
So in terms of the student activism, it seems worse in the United States, but in terms of the legal tools that we possess, we're worse off. That's the best way to summarize it, correct?
Yeah, definitely. There's positives and negatives.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's drill down now on the recently released Campus Freedom Index. I think it's been going on for a few years. Actually, I discussed your earlier instantiation of that campus report in my talk that I gave at University of Ottawa on the thought police and how it regulates the free exchange of ideas. I had cited your work, but a new report has come out since. So maybe we could talk about first about what the report is generally about, and then we can drill down about specific methodology, and then what are some general patterns that we can glean from it.
Yeah, so as soon as the Justice Center was formed, we recognized this problem. One of our first cases, in fact, I believe our first case was these students, the Pridgeon brothers at the University of Alberta, who had gotten into trouble because they created a Facebook group where they made disparaging remarks about their professor, about the conduct of her classes, about how she conducted her lesson plans and her grading mechanisms. And the university slapped them with a misconduct violation. They asked them to write a public apology letter to the professor. And so this went to court, and the court ruled that was an unfair violation of these students' free expression rights. And that was the case where we saw a charter application to the public university campus, where the judge ruled that the university is not a charter-free zone. So we saw this problem already existing. We saw numerous student groups being shut down on campus, being denied equal access to services that other students were paying for and that they were paying for too. And so we saw this need. And of course, if you see a problem, you have to find a solution. And we thought we were well positioned. We had a great team of lawyers who could defend these students and hopefully make a difference. And so we thought that the Campus Freedom Index would be a great way for us to analyze exactly what is happening on each university campus in Canada, so that we can better inform students before they apply to these schools. What exactly are you getting into? If you value activism, if you value free academic freedom and the freedom to conduct your research and to speak your mind on campus and to participate in a true free exchange of ideas, we want to give these students some sort of way of knowing which universities to avoid and which universities are good. And so the Campus Freedom Index allows us to weed out the bad ones, to put a spotlight on their behavior when they censor, and to look at their policies and find out exactly how would these universities act according to their policies when they are confronted with a controversial event and the threat of censorship. So the Campus Freedom Index is that only resource that we have in Canada that does look at free speech across the spectrum from coast to coast, 60 universities, and provides a grade so that students can better understand what they're getting involved in.
So let me summarize, at least when I read the report, and then you could fill in any important details that I'm missing. I think you've got 4 metrics, basically: university policies and university practices, and student union policies and student union practices. And then you've got a set of indicators that you look at, and you very clearly state, well, if this is available or this is missing and so on, this gets you an A, this gets you a B. So you've got an A, B, C, D, F, which you then give to each of these 4 metrics. Am I doing well so far?
Yeah, really good.
Okay. And so if we've got 60 universities, each of which is being graded on 4 metrics, now we've got 240 possible grades. As somebody who is in the business of giving students grades, I'm very familiar with the grading policies. And so then we can look at, so what is the distribution of A's versus, say, all the way to F's? And now I was very disheartened to read the following. So let me read it, and then you could tell us about it. So out of 240 grades across awarded to 60 campuses, there were 6 A grades, 6 out of 240. Oh boy. 2 fewer than in 2015. Conversely, F grades were earned 32 times. What the hell is going on at Canadian universities?
Yeah, I should say about the methodology too that, of course, we don't buy into this trend that we've seen at some universities, perhaps across the board. You could speak to it, perhaps, of grade inflation, where it's becoming easier to B's and A's. We think that an A is exceptional behavior, and so the criteria to get an A, universities and these student unions have to make a clear and unequivocal stand in favor of free speech, and so we clearly don't see that happening very often, and we don't even see a lot getting B's. It's C's and D's are the vast majority that are awarded, and F's are very close third to that. So most universities, or almost half of these universities that we study, are censoring speech beyond the legal limits in some way, and that really speaks to the problem that we have in Canada, where so many of our institutions of higher learning, and many of these that do get Fs, are some of the highest populated as well. Where more of our students are attending. So many Canadians are being affected. Canadian students are being affected when all of these universities are violating free speech. And so what the findings do tell us is that there is a big problem, and that universities really need to pick up their game. And I also wanted to speak to the separation of student unions and universities. It's not like in the States, and we had conversations with our counterparts at FIRE about this, because they don't look at student associations separately. But in the United States, the university controls much more of the student life aspects that students would be participating in. Student clubs and organizations are usually ratified through the university, and so the university maintains all of those rules and regulations, and student associations don't play a very large role south of the border. In Canada, student unions are legally at least quasi-autonomous from the university. We don't consider them private institutions because, of course, students are not compelled they don't have a right to opt out of their student union. That's something that we would really like to see. In Australia and New Zealand, they have the right to opt out of their student union, whereas in Canada, if you want to study at the University of Toronto, you must join and pay fees and services to that union. So we measure student unions separately because they are operating as autonomous organizations within the campus, and they control much more of student life than in America, and because of that, because they're the ones that are deciding which clubs get space for events, which clubs get funding, and in many cases, whether a speaker on campus will get a space in student union run space, they play a bigger role in Canada. And so we assign a different grade and study them separately from their university counterpart. And what you do see is that student unions, I believe it was 7 universities earned an F grade, but it was 25 student unions that earned F grades as well. And so really, because of the way that the division of responsibility is in Canada, student unions play a bigger role in student life, and therefore they have a bigger part to play in protecting or infringing upon free speech.
So I have several, I guess, related questions. Generally speaking, if we were to look at the grade distribution across the university versus the student unions, did you say that student unions on average score worse than the universities? They do. Okay. So then given that, are there though similar reasons? So it's one thing to grade, the metrics, but then do you try to surmise what might be at the root cause of the ethos that is allowing for these violations to happen, both for the student unions versus the universities? And are those the same, or is it different mechanisms that is compelling each to violate?
I think the context is much different. And just looking at the student union context, leadership is very fluid, Usually student union presidents and student union executives change substantially from year to year. So you can get a new slate of people in who have very different ideas and want to do very drastic changes, and have a different approach to these to this censorship versus safe space debate. And they might then be more the likelihood that these student leaders will change course and start rejecting free speech on campus is higher with student unions because of that fluid leadership. The other point is that oftentimes, I believe it was at Concordia where the last election had a 12% turnout or perhaps worse, meaning that, and then if it's a close election, then that means that 6% of the student body is electing these people into power, and that allows very radical sects of the student population who have a good voter turnout, voter get out the vote mechanism. They can really dominate these elections and get a very radical slate into power, and that's typically what you see at these student unions is the leadership and the council does not really reflect the ideas and values of the whole student body, who may just be more concerned with their studies and with other things, other aspects that they're paying for at this university than student politics. But the consequences of that is that radical leaders can often take power, and if it's the radical left, then they can censor speech that they don't agree with, and that can be very dangerous. So the student union context, because of the way that student union leadership is put in through the electoral process and simply through the short-term nature of the job and kind of the part-time nature, extracurricular nature of the job. They don't take it so seriously, and because they're so young too and still becoming adult citizens and engaged and intelligent citizens, they may not know exactly how the charter applies or how free speech rights apply or why free speech is so important on a university campus. And so the culture is very different as well, given their age. Whereas with universities, I think the push has in part been because of the culture of the student unions and how they influence the university decision making and can cause a controversy on campus. But universities are also becoming much more concerned about publicity and public relations. And oftentimes we see it with the Jordan Peterson case. They're prioritizing public relations over exactly what their fundamental value is, which is being the incubator of good ideas, of future ideas, and allowing those ideas to be debated and discussed freely on campus. And so I think the trends are somewhat different and the motivations might be different for both universities and student unions, but we do see that student unions are a much bigger problem in the Canadian context.
Well, and it seems, and I'll come back to the Jordan Peterson case in a second, it seems as though there's an inherent self-selection bias when it comes to who presents themselves for student government positions, right? The typical activist, now I don't have any empirical data for this, but I certainly have sort of anecdotal data, that the typical student activist who cares about sort of, getting involved in all these issues, oftentimes is not likely to be the student who is studying number theory and who's studying neurobiology. There is a constellation of predictor variables that can help me probably predict with quite a bit of accuracy who is going to be the typical archetype of the social justice warrior student activist type. Based on your experience, without having given you more variables that describe that archetype, would you agree with that assessment that there is sort of a type of student, a small minority who is ultimately causing a lot of headache to the larger majority that just want to go about studying neurobiology and classics and physics and so on?
Yeah, and it speaks to the bigger issue of apathy and how you can be legitimately apathetic, but still these student unions have a lot of power, and if you're not checking them with reasonable discourse and reasonable ideas, then you do allow these more radical factions to represent everybody, and that's why you see so many student unions now taking positions on very controversial issues like BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, on fossil fuels divestment, even though there are a vast number of students that they're supposed to be representing that don't agree with that position and that maybe didn't even participate or know about the vote because they simply don't care about that student politics. But it's still because of that, the radicals can take advantage of that.
Well, I've had students approach me both in person and via email to say that some of the dynamics, at least at my university, are so chilling that they're afraid, even if they wish to participate in the dialogue, specifically on issues like BDS, specifically on issues dealing with Israel and other, hot trigger positions, that they're really either shouted down or intimidated, physically intimidated, if not psychologically intimidated, and they're at a loss as to what to do because they're kind of confused, right? I mean, on the one hand, they think that, well, wait a minute, don't we live in a free country where I can express myself? And they quickly realize that no, you will be shut down one way or the other. I mean, as you probably know, this wasn't back in 2002, I think. At the time, I was a visiting professor at UC Irvine, so I wasn't in Montreal. None other than the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, was unable to give a lecture. So I know that it's pretty bad all over the place, but I can assure you that in some universities it is quite chilling. And certainly from personal anecdotes, I received these emails. I mean, you would think that you're in some dictatorial, totalitarian regime. It's really quite extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And in our report, we do talk about this chilled climate effect that censorship has. And a lot of times when we get feedback from universities or student unions, or they're speaking to the media about the report, they'll often criticize the fact that we do consider in our grading events that have happened 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, because it can have a long-term effect on those first-year students that are deciding, how active am I going to be? Do I really want to shake the boat too much, or is that going to have a bad effect on my reputation or my perhaps my academic record? You don't know, and so there is definitely a chilled climate effect that comes into play here, where one incident of censorship can have ripple effects for years to come. And we saw this, in fact, at Ryerson University. There was a so-called Men's Issues Awareness Club that tried to get student club ratification status from the student union, but they were denied that status because the women's collective had an issue with this club. They believed that they were anti-feminist and that their ideas would somehow promote opposition to feminist ideas, and so that was essentially the justification for removing for not permitting this club to be a recognized student group. And then these students said, after this whole ordeal that they went through trying to get this club started because they were passionate about those ideas, they said they didn't want to try again because they had been so turned off by that whole process of them trying to get involved on their own campus and raise awareness about issues in an academic setting. And then they were rejected. They don't want to try again. And it was only when a new group of students kind of tried to start that club that they again tried to apply just last year and were again denied by the union. But this group of students, and we're thankful for this, has accepted the Justice Center's assistance to take this student union to court and try to overturn that decision and find it unreasonable.
So if I compare, so you're speaking about the court mechanism. If I compare the United States to Canada, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I certainly sort of know enough about the mechanisms to get a general sense, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that in the U.S., the way the law is set up is that it could be incredibly punitive to a violating entity to violate you on whatever relevant, legal statute. And so you will pay for it by me taking you to the cleaners, whether it be, medical malpractice suit, or whether it be, endless other, you give me an environment that is hostile in the workplace, I will sue you for $100 trillion, right? And in the U.S., people are deathly afraid of that, precisely because I think the legal system is set up to be very litigious and to be punitive to those who commit those infractions. I remember I was at a university in the U.S. where I was being, very severely harassed by a student, and I kept trying to sort of resolve it amicably, both with the student and hoping that the university would ultimately step in and protect me from the student. And then only when I decided to bring in the threat that you should be not only worried about the student suing you, but you should be worried about the possibility of how I'm going to come after you legally, did they perk up and pay attention and resolve it really quickly. Now, would it be correct to, number one, say that Canada doesn't have as biting of a system? And can we hope that that might change so that you could really hold these folks accountable to their violations?
Yes, it is true that the lawsuit culture in American jurisprudence isn't so overwhelming as in Canada, and in other contexts, you could argue that that's a good thing. But in this, in terms of the actual cost of going to court and of litigating these proceedings, it is a significant cost to these universities or student unions, and just the cost of proceeding with these legal matters can be in many ways enough to turn these student unions and universities away from censoring. And the Justice Center has been involved in a number of incidents where we heard that an event was going to be canceled, or that security fees were going to be charged to a student group to cover the security of securing the event from protesters who might break the law. And when we advise these universities and student unions about how they're breaking the law and why they're breaking the law, and what would happen if they did break the law, that is often enough to scare away these bureaucrats from proceeding with that censorship. And so there is a cost to it, and at the student union level, you could argue it's more significant because they have smaller budgets. But I mean, the problem with the public university is that they are receiving so much money from taxpayers, upwards of 95, 96% in some cases, and they're using that money then to proceed with these legal matters and to try to defend themselves in court, and then in many cases to appeal and lose again. And so I think it becomes it's still very much a cost issue, and that certainly plays into our tactic of trying to litigate these cases and hold universities to account when they do censor.
Can a student whose rights have been violated, for example, freedom of speech rights, file a lawsuit that is punitive against the university, whereby he or she is personally remunerated for emotional damage, for whatever? Does that mechanism work in the context of Canadian law, or the only threat is it's going to cost you to go to court, and that's it?
I haven't seen it being used to try to seek a financial settlement, but there is always a financial reimbursement for the cost of the litigation itself to the loser, and also for any legal costs that might have been incurred as a result of the decision that the university or the student union made. But that's the most that I've seen. I'm not a lawyer myself, but we haven't used that tactic very much in our cases.
So let's look at the administrators, since ultimately one would, notwithstanding the fact that we're separating the students from the university, it's run by professors and administrators. What percentage, I know you can't give an exact number, but I'm trying to understand the dynamics. There are several factors that could be causing the administrators to be complicit in these violations. One could be that they have themselves, nefarious motives, right? They'd like to support one political side of the aisle more than another. That would be one. So let's call that sort of the biased, nefarious angle. It could be that they're just cowardly, right? So that's cowardice. They don't want to, rock the boat. And thirdly, it could be that oftentimes people are genuinely ignorant about some of these most basic tenets, right? So, for example, I often get people saying, well, what's wrong with me going and screaming down somebody who is going to speak? I'm only exercising my freedom of speech, right? Because they genuinely think that verbally shouting down somebody from speaking is just two groups engaging in a public exchange of ideas, right? And these are otherwise sophisticated people who say these idiotic things. So what percentage is due to diabolical, nefarious reasons, cowardice, and just idiocy?
There was a study done maybe 6 years ago now that quizzed high school graduates in Canada on their knowledge of the Charter, and I think it was something like 82% didn't know that the Charter protected individuals from the government, and that's kind of a fundamental point that's missing in our civics education at the high school level, and then these students are bringing that to university. It seems to me, though, that the age group that is now occupying the offices of leadership at the university level, they should be more aware what happened in the 50s and 60s, the Vietnam protests, the anti-war protests, the whole hippie movement, and how important free speech was to those movements, and looking at it from the gay rights fight in the 70s and 80s, how important were freedom of association and freedom of speech to those groups being able to succeed with their ideas battle, and to get their ideas out there and to be considered more legitimate. Those rights were very important to them, and so you would think that these people would take that to their current offices, but you're still seeing that once these people get into positions of power where they could change that or alter course, they're still following those same principles of avoiding any controversy and trying to shut down speech that might be considered offensive or too controversial for the campus. And so it's kind of puzzling why the current leadership at the university level doesn't recognize how important these free speech rights are at the university context and in general.
So am I implicitly, do I put you down for cowardice? Is that a gentle way of you saying that out of the three, probably cowardice is the one that's driving certainly the administrators?
Yes, and I think you see that too when we hear about these cases of censorship that are about to happen or that have just happened, and then simply sending a letter explaining how the law applies and advising that these students are interested in defending their rights if it goes that far. That's usually enough to turn these people away from their censorship, and so I think that definitely plays a role in it as well. But if nobody's there to watch them, if we're not there to watch what they're doing, then they will prioritize public relations. And what we're trying to do is, if they're going to play the public relations game, then we'll produce some publicity about the wrongdoings that they're committing and change the discussion.
This is why you're on my show, right?
Yes.
So let me ask you, since you mentioned earlier Jordan Peterson, so let's talk about the Jordan Peterson case, and then a more recent case, or roughly around the same time, Janice Fiamengo's case. Let's talk about those two, how you may or may not be involved with them, and are there any other cases that we need to add to this SAD queue? I mean SAD, S-A-D, not S-A-A-D.
The faculty, we haven't defended a lot of faculty ourselves, and part of the reason is because the professors' unions are pretty good when it comes to academic freedom and standing up for academic freedom, and they often will finance litigation proceedings if it comes to that. And so we try to focus on who really needs the help in our context, and that's students and guests that students might bring onto campus. But the obvious what happened in the Peterson case, and I'm more familiar with the Peterson case than I am with the recent Fiamengo case, although we did include previous incidents where Professor Fiamengo was censored at the University of Ottawa. I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago now. She was likewise shouted down at her speaking event, and the university did not do anything to prosecute those students, despite the fact that they had video evidence of who those students were, but they just didn't see it as their role to do that. But with the Peterson case, it really does speak to this very trigger-happy way that the universities are conducting themselves now, where the instant they see something controversial happening, their knee-jerk reaction is to try to suppress that speech, is to try to shut it down, is to try to stop it, rather than accepting that is part of the university life. That is what university is about. They still have that knee-jerk reaction to try to reprimand or to warn or threaten their faculty when they speak out of line. And the issue of the university requiring these professors to try to use these gender neutral pronouns is very troubling, because then you're really asking them to say certain things and asking them to not say certain things on a very contentious issue still in Canada. We see what's happening in Alberta now with Bill 10 and the gender guidelines, and now the school, the Minister of Education has in fact closed down some private schools that were not abiding by the bill. So it's so we see this as a very contentious issue still in Canada, and yet the University of Toronto is trying to decide for everybody how they should at least speak publicly on this issue, and that's very troubling.
Now, I mean, you obviously know that I'm somebody who's been talking against all this stuff for a very long time. and I receive tons of messages, more than I can count, of people who are very appreciative of what I do, what someone like Peterson does, what Flamengo does. And so we clearly see, at least in our communiques, that there are a lot of people who, at least in the shadows, are fully aware of the dangers that we're facing, and hence they support our efforts. Yet, if I walk into campus, I don't feel the same love. I mean, not that I get much hate. I don't. Luckily, I don't get too much hate. Of course, for what I do, I will receive a lot of hate, but in terms of proportions, it's a lot more love than hate. Yet, I don't see a long lineup of fellow colleagues joining the fight to support Peterson, right? And I mean, if something like what's happening to Peterson is not compelling a tsunami of professors to rise up and say, what the hell is going on? I mean, how I couldn't have come up with such a nightmare if I were writing 1984 Orwell's, right? So what is it that's stopping the professors? I mean, we spoke about the dynamics with the administrators. I mean, I guess you must be communicating with other professors. What's causing them to not be compelled to stand up in sheer horror and say, I will not stand for this. I will defend my colleague?
It's in many ways it's the same as what stops many of these student groups too, and students from speaking out or taking a stand when their rights are violated. They have in many ways an irrational fear, or not really grounded in the reality of what would happen, about what would happen to their reputation permanently, what would happen to their ability to climb up the hierarchy ladder at their university, if that's something that motivates them. Then they're and maybe they're concerned that if they don't, if they can just kind of keep quiet on controversial issues, then maybe that'll open up more opportunities for advancement in the future. We don't know really. But we think that the number one goal of both university administrators and professors should be to uphold academic freedom, because that is the core of their mission. That's the core of what they're doing, and so that should always take priority. But the way that universities are conducting themselves, this whole culture of public relations and walking into an environment where you're always feeling comfortable and where you're always happy about the ideas that are being discussed, it's just not realistic. And yet the universities and many of these professors are buying into that culture, and just like at the student level, they're willing to be complacent about that because it's not something that they see as a big fear. As long as it's not ideas that I'm personally against, then I won't get involved in it. But of course, it always ends up coming back to them too.
Well, I'll add to that. I think the calculus here is whether you are a careerist, in which case you might quell some of your personal, deontological ethics in order to advance in terms of your career, or whether, for example, if I may speak for myself, the biggest fear that I have is not for someone else to punish me. It is that when I go to bed at night and I put my head on my pillow to sleep, that I am perfectly comfortable with me, with anything that I've done, right? So the most brutal enemy that I have is myself against me, right? And that always then guides me to pursue what I consider to be the truth, right? Now, we can debate as to what we think is true, but for example, if I think that what Peterson is going through is an absolutely fundamentally egregious situation, then for me not to speak against it, if I went to bed, I would feel as though I've cheated him, I've cheated the truth, and therefore I'm compelled to speak. Therefore, that calculus for me outweighs my careerist concerns, right? And I think the problem is that for most people, what I just said doesn't hold, and therefore that's why you get 2 or 3 people who speak out, and then 95% of people who keep their mouths shut because they're afraid to do that. And so is there any way that we can get some of the 95% to come to the testicular fortitude side?
Well, it used to be that way. It used to be that we had a bigger cohort of people standing up for free expression, and maybe it's because the culture has really turned away from it. We've had such a politically correct culture for so long, and really these trigger warnings in safe space, microaggressions, this discussion of only allowing certain clubs on campus that we agree with, and banning others. It's all part of that politically correct culture that says that there is one objective morality, or there's certainly not an objective reality, but there is one objective correct way to say things, and if you stray from that, correct view, then you're not really participating in our society, and we're going to shun you or exclude you or deny you of your rights. And so it's really a culture thing. We have to make free speech a priority culturally again. We have to celebrate how free speech has helped us historically, helped marginalized groups be able to secure their rights and to be able to prosper and be more contributing members of society. And we have to celebrate those and remind ourselves of how quickly those rights can be undermined when we don't uphold those rights at the legal level. And so that's why the Justice Center does both educational outreach and litigation, because we really need to be educating society at the same time, and especially at the university level, because these universities are training young people to be the future leaders that are going to be holding these offices at the university, that are going to be our politicians. And if they don't have a fundamental understanding of why free expression is important, how the charter right to free expression plays in society, then we're really setting ourselves up for a disaster as far as protecting the free society.
Two more last questions and I'll let you go. So I'm hoping that we could converge towards some optimistic conclusion. Notwithstanding the disastrous grades in the latest report, is the zeitgeist, you think, changing, that we can hope that the pendulum is starting to swing, or we've yet to see the worst of the dark abyss?
I think that more and more people are starting to wake up to this idea of coddling young minds, as Greg at Fire has coined it, coddling people and kind of treating people as children, treating adults as children, and believing that people have some sort of inherent right to go through life not being offended and not being exposed to ideas that they don't agree with. The people are starting to wake up to that, and the Jordan Peterson case, I think, has done a lot to educate Canadians and to bring this issue to the forefront of exactly the problem that exists on these campuses, which is kind of a microcosm for how we might end up if we don't check these trends now in society. And so I think the fact that it's becoming so absurd now that you're seeing legitimate groups being denied status on campus, that you're seeing legitimate speakers and politicians and leaders being shouted down, and universities not taking a stand. Reasonable people are starting to realize that this is a big problem, and so that's a big part of fighting it. And like we say with the public relations game, we are playing that public relations game, and we're putting out data that shows that these universities are failing to uphold their most fundamental of missions, which is the free exchange of ideas. And so that's creating publicity that these universities should pay attention to, and perhaps it's having an effect. But it's very hard to measure, obviously, because you don't know what's going on behind the scenes at these universities in many cases, and how these decisions are being made. But certainly there hasn't been a drastic change in the grades, the general trends. We always have a very low number of A's and a very high number of F's, and that hasn't changed much at all, really. But what we are seeing at the Justice Center now is universities and student unions are starting to come to us and ask us, well, how exactly can we improve ourselves?
Oh, good.
And that's
I was going to ask you, actually, I was going to ask you exactly that, whether the students and the universities are actually consuming, if I can put it that way, your information, or whether you're basically putting the stuff out there, but they're completely ignoring it. So I'm glad, I'm comforted to know that they're paying attention to it. That's great.
Yes, and we spoke about the flaws of the student union leadership, the way that the leadership is selected, but the same mechanisms that can create bad radicals, you could say, can also empower very passionate people, students on the issue of free speech, who want to make that a priority. If they can get a good group of people to support them, then they can really make a difference when they get in. And a good case in point is Carleton. The Carleton University Students Association, in our first Campus Freedom Index, we labeled as the worst student union in Canada, and that was because they had a policy which in fact banned members of, or it labeled any staff or supporters of the Heritage Foundation. This is the very esteemed think tank in the United States. Declared them to be hate groups, and they listed them among the lines of the Ku Klux Klan and other groups. And they said that these people are banned from our campus. That was just one case. They also denied club status to a pro-life club because they believed that that the student union was a pro-choice union, and that only the pro-choice view had a right to have a voice on campus. And when our report came out and they saw this, it really empowered these students that were trying to change the leadership up a bit to make this a priority. And within 1 year, they went from being the worst student union in campus to being in Canada to being the best.
Wow.
They listened to the Justice Center. They listened to our recommendations on how their policies had to change, and they made clear statements saying that they would not repeat the same actions against their pro-life club, and that they would uphold free speech rights as being the supreme policy and the supreme guiding factor for that student association. And for the most part, they've stuck to their guns, and they've really done a great job of supporting free expression rights and upholding them. And one good example is the free speech wall at Carleton in 2013. I don't know if you're familiar, but it involved Arun Smith, was the student's name. He was a seventh-year human rights major at the time, and he might, in fact, still be a student. I'm not sure.
He's on the 2-decade plan.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Still trying to figure out the major.
Right.
But he took it upon himself to remove this wall, this property of the student club that was trying to raise awareness about free speech. He took it upon himself to remove it because he believed that all speech was not all speech was legitimate, and he was apparently this person,
the arbiter. Yeah.
Yes, what speech would be legitimate and what wouldn't, and took full responsibility for this. But the student union in that case took a very strong stance against him and his actions, and in line with the university. In fact, the student union played a role in compelling the university to take to enforce reprimands on this student because of his actions. And so we saw a complete reversal at Carleton, and we've seen that echoed at the University of Saskatchewan as well, where the student union has reversed course on its prior behaviors. It's apologized, and it's revised its policies to make it clear that nothing in their policy framework will undermine legal free expression rights.
Well, gotcha. I mean, to be honest with you, the idea of having a freedom of speech wall, or in the U.S.'s case, I think Greg Livianov had talked about this in his last book, free speech zones,
yes,
is laughable, right? Everywhere where I stand is a free speech wall. Everywhere where I stand is a free speech zone. So the fact that we have to designate specific physical and geographic areas where I can exercise my rights is frankly laughable. Let me ask you this. Are there any projects that you'd like to promote as we wrap this up that are not yet public that you'd like to maybe plug now as we wrap this thing up?
Well, the Campus Freedom Index has really evolved this year. It's no longer housed in an actual report, but it's a comprehensive web database, campusfreedomindex.ca. People can log on and quickly find and share information on how their university and their student union is behaving as far as free speech is concerned. And so we really want to make this Campus Freedom Index as interactive as possible so that people who want to make a difference can easily get involved. And if you go to campusfreedomindex.ca, click on the Take Action page, and you can email your leadership at your university or your student union. You can host an event, a free speech wall, or invite a speaker to campus, and the Justice Center will sponsor those events. And so we really just want to empower students both with the data as well as with opportunities to get active and to really speak up about these issues. And if enough students can log on and check it out and take a passion and a stance in favor of upholding free speech rights, then we can start to see the pendulum swing the other way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all the great work that you do and for coming on the show. Stay on the line. I will put a link to some of the stuff that you've mentioned, so hopefully people will check it out. Thank you so much, good sir.
Thank you.
Cheers.